April 8, 1943. 5 miles above occupied France, the sky was a canvas of crystal blue, and Oberleutnant Ralph Stickling von Hermischen, a seasoned German ace, was about to paint his masterpiece. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190, he watched a formation of bizarre, barrel-chested American fighters clawing their way up from the haze below. They were huge, clumsy, and laboring for every foot of altitude. A smirk spread across his face, hidden by his oxygen mask. He keyed his radio, his voice laced with the casual contempt of a predator watching a herd of cattle. "Look at them," he chuckled to his wingman. "The Army have sent us flying milk bottles." Below, the pilots of the U.S. 4th Fighter Group, on their very first combat mission over Europe, gripped their controls. Their brand new Republic P-47 Thunderbolts felt heavy, sluggish, each one weighing a staggering 7 tons. To the German pilots, veterans of countless battles from Poland to the Eastern Front, these American planes were a joke. They were too fat, their wings too small, their engines encased in a comically large cowling. The Germans, flying their sleek, nimble interceptors, circled above like wolves, ready for an easy slaughter. But what von Hermischen and his comrades couldn't possibly know was that they weren't looking at a mistake. They were looking at their own extinction. They were witnessing the birth of a legend, a machine that would systematically grind the Luftwaffe's fighter arm into dust. How could the most experienced pilots in the world be so catastrophically wrong? What secret was hiding inside this clumsy 7-ton beast that would turn their confident laughter into screams of terror? The answer was already loaded into its wings, a storm of 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, waiting to be unleashed by 8 synchronized Browning machine guns, a torrent of lead so dense it could saw a Messerschmitt in half in under 2 seconds. The Germans were about to learn a brutal lesson, not in aerodynamics, but in the terrifying mathematics of American industrial warfare. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born from a moment of pure panic. In June of 1940, as the German war machine rolled across France, sweeping the sky of Allied planes, the U.S. Army Air Corps sent out a desperate plea. They needed a new fighter, an interceptor that could meet the Luftwaffe's best on equal terms, particularly at high altitude, where the next war would be decided. Republic Aviation's chief designer, a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, took their request and designed something that shocked them all. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the prototype, the XP-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941, it was clear he wasn't exaggerating. It weighed almost 10,000 pounds empty, nearly twice as much as the P-43 Lancer it was meant to replace. It was built around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, 2,000-horsepower radial monster. But the engine wasn't the P-47's real secret. Its heart was a massive, complex turbo-supercharger system with enormous ducts running the entire length of the fuselage, giving the plane an almost pregnant appearance. This was the key. While German fighters used mechanical superchargers geared directly to the engine, which lost power dramatically in the thin air of the stratosphere, the P-47's turbo used the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine. This system could cram air into the engine at sea-level pressure, even at 27,000 feet. It was a high-altitude juggernaut, a fighter that could breathe where others suffocated. But on the ground, it was a killer. The training period for the first P-47 groups was a bloodbath. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 was killing more Americans in training than the Germans would in the first few months of combat. It torque rolled on takeoff, its immense propeller trying to twist the plane into the ground. It ground looped on landing, and in a dive, it built speed so violently that pilots discovered a terrifying new phenomenon called compressibility, where shock waves would form on the wings, freezing their controls solid. Yet, for the pilots who survived and mastered it, they found they weren't flying a plane. They were aiming a locomotive. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, who had become one of America's top aces, said of his first flight, "The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." The Germans, however, saw only the weaknesses. In the first combat encounters in the spring of 1943, their initial assessments seemed brutally correct. The P-47 couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190. It couldn't outclimb a Messerschmitt 109. Luftwaffe pilots, masters of the turning, swirling dogfight, quickly developed tactics to exploit these flaws. They would lure the heavy Thunderbolts into low-altitude turning fights, where agility was king, and the P-47 was a helpless whale. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, a legendary German ace, reported back to high command, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." The initial statistics were grim. In their first month of operations, the American groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The British, flying alongside in their nimble Spitfires, quietly suggested the Americans had made a catastrophic error. Their pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But a strange and disturbing pattern was emerging that German intelligence failed to grasp. The Thunderbolts that were being shot down were absorbing an unbelievable amount of punishment. One P-47 returned to base with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have vaporized a Spitfire. The massive radial engine, with no vulnerable liquid cooling system, could take direct hits and keep running. The pilots were protected by a heavy steel armor plate and a bulletproof windscreen. The plane was, by every measure, a flying tank. The Germans saw a clumsy liability. They failed to see a survivor. But what happens when that survivor gets its guns on you? That question would be answered on June 26, 1943, in an encounter that would become a legend. A story that would send a shockwave of disbelief through the entire Luftwaffe. The pilot was Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying at the tail end of a formation returning from an escort mission. Suddenly, the sky erupted. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from JG-26, led by the brother of the famous Adolf Galland, executed a perfect ambush, diving out of the sun. Johnson's Thunderbolt was caught in a hailstorm of cannon fire. In seconds, his aircraft was mangled. 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his plane. The canopy shattered, blinding him. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling was ripped away, and fire erupted from the instrument panel. Wounded in the leg and nose by shrapnel, Johnson's first instinct was to bail out. He pulled the canopy release, but it wouldn't budge. A cannon shell had exploded in the track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a burning, falling coffin at 27,000 feet. What happened next should have been impossible. With no forward visibility, a violently shaking engine, and controls that barely responded, Johnson somehow managed to level the aircraft and point its nose towards England. The P-47, a flying collection of holes and fire, kept flying. Then, a lone Focke-Wulf spotted the crippled straggler. The German pilot moved in for an easy, merciless kill. He positioned himself perfectly and opened up with everything he had: 4 20mm cannon and 2 heavy machine guns. Johnson could only brace himself behind his armor plate and wait for the end. The Thunderbolt shuddered as it absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load of the German fighter. Still, it flew. The German pilot, his cannons empty, repositioned and fired again with his machine guns. Nothing. In utter disbelief, the German pulled up alongside Johnson's wreck. Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression melting from confidence to confusion to something that looked like fear. He was staring at a ghost. The German pilot emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the P-47. It was useless. The American dinosaur refused to die. Finally, out of ammunition and options, the German pilot simply shook his head in amazement, gave Johnson an informal salute, and peeled away. When Johnson's P-47 finally crash-landed at Manston, the ground crew stopped counting the bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from his head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind him. 3 of the 4 main structural beams of the fuselage were shot clean through. The plane had no right to exist, yet it had brought its pilot home. When the report of this encounter reached German intelligence, they refused to believe it. It was a lie, Allied propaganda. But the testimony from their own pilots confirmed the impossible. The flying milk bottle had taken everything their best fighter could throw at it and had simply shrugged it off. A seed of doubt had been planted. The laughter was beginning to die down. The Americans now knew they had a survivor. The problem was, surviving wasn't enough. They had to learn how to kill. The answer came from brutal, bloody trial and error. Men like Hub Zemke realized that trying to fight the German way was suicide. They had to throw out the rulebook and invent a new one. A doctrine built not around the P-47's weaknesses, but its unique, monstrous strengths. Don't turn with them, Zemke drilled into his pilots. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight, use your power, use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, once its greatest liability, was about to become its most terrifying weapon. In a dive, nothing in the sky could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could plummet towards the Earth at over 550 miles per hour, a speed that made German fighters seem like they were standing still. American pilots perfected what they called the boom and zoom. They would climb to altitudes the Germans could barely reach, 30,000 feet or higher. When enemy formations appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll over and dive. They became 7-ton meteors, screaming downwards with unstoppable energy. At the bottom of that dive, they unleashed their real secret weapon. The Germans were used to the sporadic thumps of cannon fire, weapons that were powerful but carried very little ammunition. They were not prepared for the sound of 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns speaking at once. It wasn't a burst of fire. It was a solid, uninterrupted stream of destruction. A wall of lead traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At a convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 streams of bullets met in a zone just 6 feet across. Any aircraft that entered that zone for even a fraction of a second simply ceased to exist. They didn't get shot down. They didn't trail smoke. They disintegrated. They were shredded into clouds of metal confetti. The first true demonstration of this new reality came on August 17, 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. American bombers were striking deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Major David Schilling, leading a flight of 4 P-47s, spotted a formation of German Me-110 destroyers, twin-engine bomber killers bristling with cannons and rockets. Schilling's Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. A German gunner who survived later recounted the horror. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. The one ahead of us simply came apart, not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from the fuselage, tail severed. In 2 seconds, a plane became nothing. In less than a minute, Schilling's flight annihilated 8 of the specialized bomber killers. German pilots had never experienced such concentrated, overwhelming violence. Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe, described it best: when you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him. By the fall of 1943, the Germans were discovering another horrifying truth. The P-47's performance actually improved with altitude. At 30,000 feet, where the thin air choked their own engines, the turbo-supercharged double wasp was in its element, delivering its full 2,000 horsepower. This reality was fatal for Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's greatest aces, with 206 victories. On October 8, 1943, he led an attack on B-17s over Bremen. At 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf was sluggish and unresponsive. As P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, Philipp's squadron were sitting ducks. Robert S. Johnson, the same pilot who had survived being shot to pieces months earlier, was now a seasoned killer. His combat report was brutally clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. The death of Hans Philipp sent a chill through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a hero with over 500 combat missions, could be swatted from the sky so easily, what chance did an average pilot have? But the Thunderbolt still had one glaring weakness: its climb rate. German pilots knew that if they could force the fight upwards from a low altitude, they still had an advantage. So how did the Americans solve this final piece of the puzzle and turn the P-47 into the ultimate angel of death? The answer wasn't a new engine or a redesigned wing. It was something much simpler, yet it would change everything. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England, fitted with a massive 13-foot diameter paddle blade propeller. These broad, powerful blades bit into the air like giant oars, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The P-47's climb rate surged by nearly 30%, suddenly matching or even exceeding its German rivals at all altitudes. The last sanctuary the German pilots had, their advantage in the vertical fight, was gone. The new propeller also changed the sound of the aircraft, creating a deep, thundering roar as the blade tips went supersonic. German ground troops could now hear them coming from miles away. They gave it a new name: Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. With its final weakness eliminated, and now equipped with external fuel tanks that stretched its range deep into Germany, the Thunderbolt became the ultimate escort fighter. But its story was about to take another turn. As the newer, longer-range P-51 Mustangs began taking over the primary escort role, the P-47 was unleashed in the role that would make it a nightmare for the entire German army: ground attack. They called them Jabos, from the German Jag bomber, or fighter bomber. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter bomber, it was a flying artillery battery. Its 850s could shred trucks, locomotives, and light armored vehicles. But now, it was armed with a staggering payload. It could carry two 1,000-pound bombs and a 500-pounder on its center line, a bomb load equal to an early war medium bomber. It could also carry 10 5-inch rockets, each with a destructive power of a 105mm artillery shell. During the Normandy campaign, the P-47s systematically erased the German army from the roads of France. Oberst Hans von Luck, a panzer commander, experienced their fury firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect was devastating. The Wehrmacht was paralyzed. Any movement during daylight was suicide. On D-Day itself, over 500 Thunderbolts formed an impenetrable umbrella over the invasion beaches. A German pilot who tried to break through reported that the sky was stacked with P-47s from sea level to 30,000 feet. Of the 12 fighters in his group, he was the only one to return. The P-47s, he said, turned their planes into aluminum rain. The Germans were now being beaten tactically. Their planes were being outfought, their armies pinned down, but they still believed in their superior skill and fighting spirit. The final, soul-crushing blow wasn't delivered in a dogfight. It was delivered on a balance sheet. It was the moment they realized they weren't fighting an air force. They were fighting a factory. That moment came on January 1st, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte. In a last, desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 900 fighters in a surprise attack on Allied airfields. At Airfield Y-34, home to the 365th Fighter Group, the attack was a success. German fighters swept in, destroying 22 P-47s on the ground. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post, pointed at the burning wrecks and taunted the American commander. "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' response became a legend. He pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already clearing the debris. "By tomorrow," he said, "we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk vanished. He knew the truth. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England. The Americans had lost planes, which were replaceable. The Luftwaffe had lost 213 pilots, including many of their last veteran leaders and instructors. They were irreplaceable. This was the true nature of the war the Germans had stumbled into. It wasn't about tactics or courage anymore. It was about production. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47s, more than any other American fighter. At its peak, the factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, rolled a new Thunderbolt off the assembly line every single hour, 24 hours a day. The United States was training 30,000 pilots a year, more than Germany trained during the entire war. The average American pilot arrived in Europe with 400 hours of flight time. By 1945, German pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100. It wasn't a fair fight. It was an avalanche of steel and lead. By the spring of 1945, the mockery of 2 years prior had been replaced by a deep, instinctual dread. German medical officers identified a new condition they called Jabo fever. Jabo fever. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Soviet fighters without flinching would become physically ill at the mention of Thunderbolts. The deep rumble of their engines caused panic among ground troops, who knew they had seconds to find cover before the sky fell on them. The same Joseph Pips Priller, who had called the P-47 a pregnant cow, was interviewed by propaganda officials. His statement was so demoralizing it was never published. "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built," he said. "Its firepower is unprecedented. But beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one, it is gone forever. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling." In a post-war interview, General Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, delivered the final verdict. "We made a terrible mistake," he said. "We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us." The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever built. It began its career as an object of derision, a clumsy giant that seemed destined for failure. But it ended the war as an instrument of total annihilation, a symbol of a new kind of warfare where victory was forged not just in the cockpit, but on the assembly line. The German pilots had laughed at the flying milk bottle in 1943. By 1945, there were almost no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.